Welcome to today's webcast. This call is being recorded. And now, to begin the program, I'd like to introduce Chris Flack.
Hey, thanks so much, everybody in our audience, for joining us today for today's webcast, Reducing Risk in the Application Development Lifecycle, sponsored by Flexera. I'm Chris Flack with Redmond Magazine, and I'm here to be your host for today's event, so thank you all for joining. Just a few quick reminders before we begin today's presentation and introduce our presenter. Just a couple quick things really briefly. So first things first is we are recording today's event for future viewing purposes. We'll send you an email within 24 hours after the webcast is over where you can view the replay. Please feel free to share that with coworkers and friends who may be interested. You could also use the little paper airplane icon down there in the dock of your screen to actually share with somebody right now. It'll send them an email, they could join you in the console, and you guys can enjoy the webcast together. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end of today's call. Please feel free, however, at any point during the presentation to enter your question via the Ask a Question box on the left-hand side of your console. Hopefully, if time permits, we'll get to everybody's questions and get out some answers. Please don't be shy and ask any question at any time. We do encourage it. Participation is our favorite. Joining us for today's webcast, we have a really great presenter. His name is Tim Warner. Tim is an IT professional, Microsoft MVP, and Pluralsight author based in Nashville, Tennessee. He's been involved in all forms of IT since 1997 and can be found on Twitter at TechTrainerTim. And without any further ado, I will hand everything over to Tim, so please get started.
Fantastic, Chris. Thanks very much. And thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today. Let's take a look at what I have planned. As Chris said, there's going to be time for Q&A. I figured we can split things in half. I'll give a lesson for about 30 minutes, maybe a little less, and then the rest of the time will be devoted to getting your questions answered. Specifically, my lesson today focuses on the software asset management, or SAM lifecycle. We're going to start by looking at what you and your business might have done historically or what you might have done in previous positions in managing the deployment and maintenance of software. We'll then define the problem space in 21st century IT. We've got terms like DevOps and continuous integration, continuous deployment floating around. What does all this mean in terms of application management, deployment management? We'll learn some methods for taking control of SAM, and we'll end with a call to action before the Q&A. Now, due warning, there's quite a bit of material that I tend to pack into my lessons. So be aware, Chris mentioned that little paper airplane icon at the bottom of your web player. Also be aware of the button to its immediate left, the one that looks like a sheet of paper, because that's where you'll be able to download a PDF representation of this slide deck, as well as I believe Flexera has added some assets of their own in there. To that point, when it comes time for Q&A, I'll bring in, if he's willing, my understanding is that Tim Davis from Flexera Software will be happy to answer any product-specific questions that you have. So let's get rocking and rolling with this. The first piece is reviewing software asset management, the life cycle historically over time in information technology. Well, of course, we need to, what's the saying? We need to crawl before we can walk and walk before we can run. What is software asset management, or SAM? It goes by several different TLAs, three-letter acronyms, but this one will work for our purposes now. A business practice that involves managing and optimizing the whole application lifecycle, from purchase to deployment to maintenance to use to troubleshooting, I'll throw in, and ultimately disposition of software applications with an organization. Upgrade would certainly fit in there as well, if you need to move to a more recent version. This comes to us, this nice graphic. In fact, two graphics from my presentation come directly from the Flexera body of knowledge, so do credit to them. But this one's a nice circular diagram that shows the software asset management lifecycle. You notice in the middle the three verbs there: automate, optimize, and secure. So we can look at the diagram starting in the 12 o'clock position. Think about how you've done business with software to date. There's probably, you have some kind of IT service management system in place where a user, a group, a department can request an application. They make their case. Ultimately, the purchase is approved. There's the purchase piece. Then it's up to your operations staff to figure out the most efficient means of deploying the software. while at the same time keeping track of dependencies. Discover and manage. What are you doing as far as license management for this software? What kind of software agreement, if any, do you have with the software vendor? I mean, I'm thinking of third-party applications, but you could just as well have line of business apps that you've developed in-house that follow this very same life cycle. Over time, software is going to eventually be added to, especially now, as I said, with this continuous integration pipeline business. You've got the ability to push code changes and put out newer builds of your software, potentially on a nightly basis. What are you doing as far as containing and constraining and managing the upgrade and patch management cycle? And ultimately, if you're not going to upgrade software, if it's reached its end of life, or if as a business you've decided to move into a different direction, there's retirement plans and all of the dependencies that are involved there. It could be a case of application X uses Y file type, and if you retire application X, how are your users going to operate with file type Y? You see what I mean? How rigorous you are with this life cycle completely depends on a number of things, doesn't it? I know from personal experience you can walk into an environment that's been on point with this for many years, and maybe, for instance, be a Microsoft shop that uses the System Center data center management products, and you have SAM pretty well organized between System Center Configuration Manager, Windows Server Update Services, etc. On the other hand, some businesses, even larger businesses I've found, have more of a, I'm not going to say cavalier, but for whatever reason, more of a disorganized process. And the stakes tend to get pretty high in that regard. So I think the reason why you're here, one reason among many maybe, is that you want to figure out some ways to get a better handle on your software deployment and maintenance lifecycle. So congratulations for your self-awareness coming here today. A software vulnerability is formally defined as a weakness in a software asset or potentially a group of software assets that can be exploited by one or more threats. Here's where we're taking a darker turn. There's the logistics of software asset management, the procurement, deployment, maintenance, retirement, etc. And then there's the question of what vulnerabilities may exist in the software that we have deployed and are currently maintaining. What could those vulnerabilities expose in terms of proprietary data, customer information, personally identifiable information? It seems almost every day you hear about some data dump or zero-day exploit popping up in not just open source software, but closed source proprietary software just as well. So those weaknesses can be exploited by one or more threats. A threat could be a person, a group, or it could be code. And actually the exploit and the threat may be something completely innocuous. Your software may have a vulnerability that exposes data that it shouldn't, and just in the day-to-day operation of the software and your users doing what they should be doing with the software, the vulnerability is nonetheless leaking data that could cause grave problems for your business, you see. So it's not necessarily the case of a bad actor or a so-called black hat hacker maliciously trying to do damage. So that ramps up the importance of what's called software vulnerability management. Again, this comes from Flexera. They have their own research team. I don't know if you're aware of it. It's called Secure Research. So this diagram integrates that. Let me see. I've got little call-out markers. We can start and say the 11 o'clock position on this diagram where, for instance, by tapping into the Secure body of knowledge, you can become aware of a new vulnerability that's been discovered. Technically, a zero-day vulnerability is a software weakness that hasn't been formally reported to the software vendor yet, so therefore no fix or patch is available. You want to be alerted as proactively as humanly possible when these vulnerabilities are exposed, if they expose something that you have in your infrastructure. Once you've identified and verified that you do have a particular vulnerability, it's a question of making sure you have a grasp of your software asset inventory, making sure you know where every instance of a particular piece of software is, and that you're not leaving anything out. That's a worst case scenario. You forget about a server that's running a service or an application that may have a weakness or a vulnerability. Again, all this is really to support the idea of adopting a solution, a methodology, a solution suite perhaps, that can address all of this and round up all of these management points into a single, what term do I want to say, a single pane of glass? I guess that'll do for now. After you've figured out exactly what your reach of vulnerability is with your systems, it's a question of assessing and prioritizing the risk. The risk is how likely is it that someone or something could take advantage of that vulnerability and cause damage, data theft, server crashes, whatever it might be, remote administration. Then we get into the mitigation, move out of assessment into mitigation, where you're applying a remediation or potentially a workaround. If the software vendor hasn't deployed a fix yet, you may need to temporarily not disable the service or application as a workaround. Once the mitigation has been deployed, it's a question of verifying that the so-called hole is closed. I think I said that correctly. And then around the bend we go. So again, this is a proactive, iterative process that really never stops. I guess that's why we IT people will never be hurting for work, because there's always stuff to do, isn't there? What is the problem space? Well, you might be thinking, Tim, well, geez, you've kind of outlined the problem space pretty good so far. The crucial importance of knowing what we have with our software asset management, and the crucial importance of being on the front end, of being notified when vulnerabilities happen with our software, and making sure we have a process in place to do discovery, remediation, and alerting. Well, we'll go a little bit further. On this next slide, we have some complexities related to software packaging and deployment. So we've kind of ping-ponged, started with software deployment, looked at vulnerabilities, and now we're ping-ponging back to the first piece here. I meant for these little blocks to come out one at a time. I'm sorry they're coming all at you once. We'll start with application virtualization. My point in this slide, everybody, is to show that applications have really, they're multi-tentacled beasts, aren't they? And what I mean by that is that it wasn't too many years ago that an application was an application. There wasn't a question of thick client versus thin client necessarily. Nowadays, we can stream applications over the local network, intranet, even over the internet. There's Microsoft AppV, there's Citrix, XenApp, lots of platforms for streaming applications. Virtual desktop infrastructure where you can stream entire desktops across your network or potentially between sites. Who doesn't have a mobile device nowadays? You may need to, based on your business needs, support one or more mobile apps, and that brings up the question of BYOD, bring your own device. Are you allowing employees to bring in their own mobile apps, or their mobile phones, should we say, smartphones or tablets? If so, what is the scope of control that you have in operations over their hardware? Of course, some businesses go the other direction and do company-issued hardware where there's no concern about that line of separation between the user owning the device and they feel they can do whatever they want with it, and the business owning the device where the business says, we control this, so we decide what you can and can't do. Mobile application management, and I don't have it on the slide, but we could fit in mobile device management, MDM, are three-letter acronyms that define a space where you could buy into a solution that just makes it simpler, quite honestly, to manage mobile devices and security policies and what apps can be installed or can't be installed. And then we have licensing. Has licensing gotten more complex with applications over the last 10 years or so? Well, given all these different form factors, my immediate answer would be yes, of course it is. And the question that I'll challenge you with right now, what kind of a grasp do you have on usage? Do you have license auditing happening? Maybe you're required to audit your license usage. I mean, back in the mid to late 90s when I got into IT, it seemed, maybe it was just my sheltered existence in upstate New York, but it seemed that many businesses were almost casual or cavalier about their server and their desktop OS licensing and, say, their Microsoft Office licensing. And I remember thinking, even though I was a newcomer to IT, I'm thinking, all Microsoft has to do is give us a call and ask us to account for our licenses, and we may be in trouble here because we're using MSDN licenses for production use and blah, 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 blah. I guess those issues still exist in 2017, but again, you may be required for compliance with whatever industry or regulatory certifications that your business needs to know exactly what software you're licensed for, and you're metering that use. And metering also has the advantage of you're not wasting money paying for licenses that aren't even being used, or worse yet, licenses that you've lost track of. This is another entire related ball of yarn. Open source software. We've seen a big push in Microsoft specifically with them open sourcing their PowerShell task automation product. They're putting a lot of their products out on github.com where you can actually inspect the source code. And if you're accustomed to closed source proprietary software where it's a black box and you never get to see what's behind the curtain, this can take some getting used to. Here's some questions. What is your OSS inventory right now? Well, you might say, well, Tim, yeah, we don't do open source software, so next question, please. Who's monitoring and supporting the open source software that you have? Again, you might be thinking, don't have it. How are you using OSS? I want to burst your bubble in a sense that there's a very high possibility that you do have software, even if it's homegrown software, that may be commercial, ostensibly closed source, but still contains open source components. And that opens up important questions, especially when it comes to vulnerabilities and security. If you are using open source software, what's your approval process and how might that differ from closed source commercial software? Versioning. When free and open source software is available, newer builds are available, because it's free and open source, you could easily, or your users potentially, could easily upgrade to another version. If your IT spans multiple sites, you might have version X.1 on one site and X.2 on the other. I guess that's the same for closed or open source software, but they're very valuable questions. Are you in compliance with service level agreements, internal operation level agreements, and with licensing? Of course, with open software, you've got various licenses still, like the GNU GPL license or the MIT license. Are you actually reading what those mean and making sure that you're working in that framework? Hopefully I piqued your interest about that point I mentioned about you may not think you have open source code in your environment, but you very well might. The first part of this bottom line slide, you need to vet your code, period. It's not just a question of throwing it into Config Manager and figuring out how to get it to your user's desktop. I submit, and Flexera Software submits, that you need to know as much as you possibly can about the security state of your software as early in the pipeline as possible. According to Secure Research, 95% of public software contains OSS. Isn't that crazy? You do a search for Microsoft, I forgot what version of Windows it was where it came out, but in their TCP/IP stack, Microsoft injected some open source components. This is going back a pretty good number of years. And of course, that raised some, well, it raised a whole bunch of stuff. But one argument among the open source community was, you're selling the software commercially, but you have open source networking components that you've put in here. And you're not, you have to open source by nature of the open source license. If you're going to use our components, you have to release all your source code, you see. So again, that might burst your bubble or be a surprise, but that's good, I think, because now you have some awareness that you might not have had 17 minutes ago. In the middle there, we have app packaging can't be monolithic. In other words, you know, the notion of the golden operating system image, that don't touch this, or we're going to operate on this image to the tiniest possible degree we have because we finally have our OSD automated. Or these applications, these pilot light applications that all users get every time you onboard a new computer. Leave those alone. We're not going to modify them until we absolutely have to. That's not really a good workable strategy, especially when you consider that these 0 days and vulnerabilities get reported every day and that your packages may include open source components. And then finally on the right, self-service as the new IT. I submit that more and more now, users are just expecting to be able to get apps by themselves through self-service and App Store. I mean, I have a 6-year-old daughter named Zoe, and she's about as natural as it can get. You can throw her any kind of mobile device, and she's going to hit the App Store and look for some kind of Pokemon add-on or whatever. But that fits in with working adults as well, of course. I'm accustomed to shopping for apps in an App Store framework. So you can absolutely do that in IT, which opens up a lot of good doors and possibilities. So let's move now to the solution, or a solution to this, taking control of software asset management, taking control of application code vetting and discovery. What are some possibilities here? Well, the goals that we're looking for in deciding on a solution are things like optimizing spend. Of course, the cost has to come into it. Compliance, making sure that whatever solution you adopt to help you with this stuff not only doesn't violate or create any problems with your compliance certifications and SLAs, but should support them and make it easier to generate reports to feed to your compliance officers. If you can do an enterprise app store to support self-service, that's going to relieve some burden on your help desk and support staff, because you know that old expression, if you give someone a fish, they eat for a day. If you teach them to fish, then they'll eat for a lifetime. Similarly, we can empower our users to be autonomous and fetch apps that they need. And we, on the IT side, can take comfort that the apps that the users select from our enterprise app store have been vetted and validated, you see. Assessing application compatibility, right. That again just goes with core SAM principles. You're thinking of introducing a very potentially expensive application into the mix. I hope you're going to do due diligence to make sure that there's no conflicts or the installation of this new app isn't going to cause problems with existing ones. Packaging and patching applications, getting some kind of automation, some kind of intelligence behind that. And then being on the front end of security risks, as we've already talked about. So those are all good and worthy goals, I think. Okay. All right, a lot of text here. Like I said, let me repeat it. That piece of paper button in your web player is where you can get a copy of this deck, because it's pretty darn heavy. This shows a call to action of changing your paradigm or your thoughts towards software asset management. You have on the left what we don't want to be, reactive, putting out fires, this sort of thing, and on the right, proactive SAM, happier camper all around. At least that's the idea. Elements of reactive software asset management, patching applications in a scramble fashion after vulnerabilities have announced. And you know, each passing day that you have vulnerabilities still active is a potential breach and a potential very bad time for your business, for your shareholders, if you're public. It could result in a huge PR problem for your business. You know, I don't have to tell you these things. Accidentally discovering OSS software components. We haven't touched OSS. We don't believe in it. Whoops. Our line of business app has vulnerable OSS components. Now what? One-off app request approvals for BYOD. Like I said earlier, the absence of an enterprise app store is going to put a burden on IT, particularly the first line of support that your users have, your service desk. And just could create a cascade of bureaucracy depending upon how big your business is with approvals and blah, 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 blah. As the wise lady said in the YouTube video, ain't nobody got time for that. And then the worry, the constant worry that keeps some IT people up at night, worry about the results of a license or compliance audit. So the happy or sunny side of proactive SAM, scheduling and validating apps on a schedule, complete visibility of OSS inventory, having visibility and systematic vulnerability scanning, being notified proactively of these 0 days or known vulnerabilities, having a centrally managed app store for your users, and optimizing license usage, not wasting. You have just enough licenses, you know where they are, you can account for them all. And that's going to make, speaking of accounting, that's going to make your accounting people a bit happier, I submit. This is, again, a diagram from Flexera's body of knowledge. It's pretty cool. It shows their app packaging and software deployment workflow. Now you notice that I've studiously avoided too many references to vendor products. Like for your configuration management, I don't know what you use. If you're not a Microsoft shop, maybe you use like Chef and Puppet, and there's lots of different CM or configuration management platforms to use. I've tried to be as broad and general as possible, and even though this slide is from Flexera, the graphic is anyway, they make really good points for anybody. Let's take it from the top. First of all, that vertical bar, process management and reporting. Yeah, so we just take comfort, number one, that we have a process in place for packaging software and deploying it. Identifying your applications and new requests for service. Validating the request, eliminating redundancy. You may be in a multinational organization and a user in West US requests an app, and before you start the whole process of approval and deployment, elsewhere in the world, another office may have already been there, done that, bought the proverbial t-shirt. If you've got a solution that gives you a single pane of glass, it's easier to ferret that kind of stuff out and save time. Determine your compatibility level for the target environments and packaging formats. Again, that's going to depend on what engine you're using for packaging and deploying software. What resources are required in terms of software, in terms of human resource capital. Actually packaging and doing testing. Measure twice, cut once. Very important. And then publishing the application for deployment. So pretty straightforward, but it's nice to be reminded of the best practices, I think. This is an image of Flexera's App Portal product. So which should come as no surprise, everything we've talked about in the last 25 minutes is answered by our sponsor, Flexera. And one of the things they have going on is an App Portal product. You see a screenshot at left. It's pretty robust. It might be a little small on your screens, but it should look immediately identifiable to any user who's visited the iTunes Store, the Google Play Store, the Windows App Store. There's even a ratings and community aspect to it, which is pretty cool, especially for larger businesses. And another thing that's neat about this product is that it integrates, it doesn't replace, but it can integrate with an IT service management solution you may already have in place, like ServiceNow or BMC Remedy. You know, I myself have been aware of Flexera almost since the start of my career. In the late 90s, I worked messing with Visual Basic 6 development a little bit. And creating Windows Forms applications, it was just assumed you were going to use Install Shield to build an installer. Well, guess who invented Install Shield? Flexera software. You may have installed software for Windows using Install Anywhere. Guess who developed that? You see, so I mean, this company really, I would say probably more than almost any other business in the world knows what they're talking about when it comes to packaging and deploying software. So I take comfort in that because they've seen just about any possible thing that can go wrong and have worked to remediate it with their products. So this slide just rolls up some of those. Like I said, I'm not going to be able to answer Flexera specific questions myself in the second half of this demo. I just rolled up a couple of the major ones here. There's Vulnerability Intelligence Manager, which gives you a live pipeline into Secunia Research's knowledge base. You can receive alerts and remediation guidance. See, so this speaks to that point earlier about being on the front end of software vulnerabilities. And the Flexera product portfolio can also take care of inventorying all your software, so you've got a umbilical cord, so to speak, between the software you actually support and Flexera/Secunia. In fact, Corporate Software Inspector is exactly that, a multi-platform inventory scanning and notification platform that integrates with, for instance, the System Center products and the Windows Server features like WSUS for patch deployment. Code Insight scans and locates open source software components. So this speaks to the stuff we've talked about quite a bit about identifying OSS components in your software and then tying that into your vulnerability intelligence. All right? Pretty compelling stuff. I hope you'd agree with me. All right, so a call to action here. Learn. Keep on learning. How's that for a conclusion? Have a nice day, everybody. Now, I have some short URL links here. These all go to flexerasoftware.com resources. timw.info/. That should be res1. I'm sorry that the 1's not showing up on the slide. Huh. But that link will take you to where they have white papers and webinars and trial software download links. Here we get the res2. Good. For Security Research, where you can read more about them, and they make quite a bit of their knowledge available for free on their public website, which is cool. And they do original research, which is always nice. And then because it seemed to make sense, I looked up a couple white papers from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, NIST. The shorty URL for this is going to depend. I have one paper on enterprise patch management at timw.info/res3. and one on IT asset management in general. I selected those papers for you if you're not yet there in your business with IT asset management and service management, and you just want some general background info. All right, so awesome. Well, thank you very much for sticking with us thus far. There's Flexera's address, and I have the rest of my contact info up on the slide right now. Twitter, Tech Trainer Tim. My work email is tim-warner@pluralsight.com. More than happy to stay in touch with you and engage you in the future. So, with that, why don't we turn our attention to some questions and answers. Okay. We have one issue that I'm mentioning this to you, Chris. If you haven't seen it, it looks like a couple people have had connectivity issues. I don't know if this is just one-off specific attendees.
Yeah, it's just a one-off. If you're having an issue, try refreshing, but we're broadcasting loud and clear. Reminder, too, that we have Tim Davis from Flexera here as well to answer any product-specific questions for Flexera. So, Tim Davis, if you're there, you're more than welcome to join us at this time. But, yeah, no, we're broadcasting loud and clear.
Good. Tim Davis, if you're there, by the way, everybody, Tim Davis is Product Marketing Manager with Flexera Software. Would you like to say anything, or you have any feedback that comes off the top of your head, Tim?
Sure, great. Thank you, Tim. So far, I love your presentation. You're bringing up a lot of points that I think a lot of people don't realize, specifically around open source. And we do hear, I do hear responses from customers. When we ask them, they're like, "Oh yeah, we don't allow open source," but it's insidious. It's pretty much all commercial software has one or two pieces or more, and it's becoming more and more common. So that's definitely a great thing to educate your audience about. And I am available for questions, so why don't you go through and let's see what we got.
Yeah, definitely. Let's see here. Okay, one question I see speaks to when we were talking about Security Research and that 0-day being proactively notified of software vulnerabilities. An attendee asked, where can I find more information and details about known or existing software vulnerabilities?
You want me to take that one?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, I'll just pitch the questions to you directly.
Sure. So if you go back on your resources slide, you had a link there to the Security Research portal. And you can go to the Security Research community, and there you can search through and view advisories of known software vulnerabilities. Last year, I think there was a total of 17,000 new software vulnerabilities identified. So it's a huge database. We have a team of people that are constantly doing research and discovering vulnerabilities and documenting vulnerabilities discovered by other organizations as well. So that's definitely a good place to start.
Okay, cool. Thank you. The next question regards your software products. Could you speak a little bit about how the trials work? the trial versions?
Sure. So a lot of our products do have a trial version available. And if you go to the resource section that Tim provided the link for, you can filter that list of resources by trials. And our Corporate Software Inspector is one of the products that we get lots of trials for, and that's for patch management. You can also download a trial of the Admin Studio product, which is for packaging, compatibility, and deployment. And Install Shield, as you said, that's another developer product that's available on our website as well.
Great, cool. The next question deals with how does your software, it sounds like App Studio, but it could be more than that, work with Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager? Could your products feasibly replace SCCM, or is it more coexistence? How does that relationship work?
Mm-hmm. No, we do not replace Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager. That's definitely that's a basic for most enterprises, right? They're using Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager to do a lot. It's not always the most user-friendly. So a lot of our products work with System Center and the investments that companies have already made in System Center to be more efficient, do things faster, reduce time, things like that. So for example, the App Store, our App Portal, our Enterprise App Store, will use Microsoft System Center Configuration Manager to deploy software and to reclaim software as well. Because the App Store doesn't only give out software, it can also remove software that's no longer being used on an endpoint and allow you to recycle that license to somebody else that may need it. Our FlexNet Manager Suite product and licensing product will take inventory from Microsoft System Center and normalize it. Right? System Center usually does an inventory, and it'll bring back thousands and thousands and thousands of rows of components. But what our software will do, we have an application recognition library. We'll take all of those components and normalize it and bring you back a list of, okay, here's the actual applications that you care about. So instead of seeing, 5 different rows of components, you get one row of, here's the software that makes up all these. Also with our Corporate Software Inspector and our patch management, that will utilize System Center as well. And we do also work with other deployment systems other than System Center, so applications like Symantec's Client Management Suite. We also work with Jamf Software's Casper Suite for managing Mac software and deployment, as well as AirWatch for mobile applications.
Boy, that's robust. You may have partially answered this next question when you talked about reclaiming a license. The question is, do your products have a way to automatically put applications back on a machine after a user gets a new machine?
Okay, so there's a couple different scenarios where that might happen, and the one I'm thinking of would be like an upgrade to Windows 10. So the App Store, App Portal, will allow you to submit your Windows 10 upgrade through the App Store, and the App Store will look and see what applications are on the computer being upgraded, and then when it's upgraded to Windows 10, it'll reinstall those applications back to that endpoint.
I see. Okay. All right. Next question here. This is a cloud-oriented question. What about software as a service software where it's a subscription model and you don't even own the software?
Yeah, so that's more and more common, right?
Yeah.
Being able to access stuff, and that way you don't have to run the infrastructure and everything. But obviously there's still license implications because you're buying access to that. So a lot of our applications will work with that as well. So for example, Office 365. That's something that I see a lot of enterprises moving to, and that's SaaS-based. And the App Store can be used to provision new accounts for that. or for Salesforce.com or Box or applications like that. So they could be in the App Store and somebody can request access, and it'll automate the provisioning of an account for you on that. Our FlexNet Manager Suite product also is looking at licensing for like Office 365 to make sure that you're in compliance and that you're maintaining the correct licensing.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Honestly, I don't know if I understand this. I think this is the last question in the queue. By the way, attendees, if you have any questions, pop them in there. I'll just read it, Tim, and see what you think. The attendee said, concerning licensing and with the case of SAP versus Diageo, as a customer, you want your information resident on systems to be used by the whole company or partners without being hit by high license costs. How to address this issue?
So I believe what they're referring to is there was a lawsuit, SAP versus Diageo, regarding indirect access licenses. And in Britain, where the case was heard, they ruled in favor of SAP, who sought a claim of about, 55 million pounds against Diageo for indirect users. Diageo is a large beverage company in Europe. And we do have a solution that can help you discover instances of indirect access for SAP and to manage and optimize the license requirements for users, SAP and non-SAP systems. So we do have I think that there was a blog post on our software license optimization blog recently on this case. So you can check there to find out more information.
Very interesting. One more question, and this comes from me. What could a business do who's adopted a piece of, say, commercial closed-source software, and by using your inspector, actually I think it would be the open source tool, you discover that it has vulnerable open source components? What do you recommend you do then? Because, are you kind of stuck?
Well, obviously visibility and knowing is the first step, right? So what we're trying to do is to bring awareness to the fact that there's open source in everything, and then you have to determine what your level of risk is, an acceptable risk. One of the most recent ones, or the ones that were in the news the most, there was a vulnerability called Heartbleed that affected servers. And a lot of off-the-shelf software developers used that particular piece of open source in their applications. And I know at Flexera we had, and in the Install Shield product I think, we were using it. So we had to quickly get a hot fix out for it. But visibility is the first thing, right? We're trying to raise awareness that this is an issue. We do have software that allow you to, scan the code for all the open source components that are found in it, identify them, let you know what criticality level the vulnerability is, whether it's high, low, or medium, and that's probably the best part about it is the visibility.
I agree. Good answer. A couple more questions came in. Boy, this is interesting because, as you know, Tim, historically you've got software licensing per user or per workstation. But this person asks, do you have mechanisms in place to determine licensing per core, like with the new Windows Server licensing, per CPU core?
Sure. So licensing agreements are some of the most complex contracts around, right? Each vendor has a different way that they want to license and entitle and monitor their software. And, one of those is by how many processors are on the server. And yes, we do have the ability to take that into account. So when we're doing license management, a lot of solutions out there for this count licenses, one for one. So you find one installation, and that matches one license. If you see two installations, you need two licenses. But that's not really the way license agreements are written. A lot of times they allow for, backup. Backup servers don't require a license.
Right.
They rely on the production license. Users can install software on their desktop and on their laptop, and that's only one license. And the same thing with the server number of processors. So because of the complexity, we help you to navigate through all that, and we will come up with a license position based on all of the rules around the license agreement. So we would take into account the number of processors in that server to determine how many licenses.
Okay, very good. That that screenshot of your app store that I showed a few slides back had Windows desktop apps shown, but an attendee just asked you, how does your software work with different mobile platform apps, iOS, Android, etc.?
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple things there. The Admin Studio product, which does packaging, testing, deployment, will handle both Windows and iOS as well as Mac OS. And again, we partner with third-party vendors on the deployment side, like AirWatch for iOS and Casper Suite for Mac OS.
Okay.
And then also on the App Store, like I said, it handles Windows apps. It'll handle the Windows operating system upgrade, mobile apps, as well as Mac apps. The real requirement is that you have a system in the back that's managing those. So Casper Suite, for example.
Okay, but as far as the user on his or her iPhone or Android device, they would download a Flexera app on their phone to access their corporate app store. Is that correct?
It's not a download of an app. It would be access to a website.
A website. Okay, got it. All right, that makes sense. Looks like this last question speaks to what you mentioned earlier about Windows 10. The question is, when your software is automatically putting applications back on a machine after rebuilding it to Windows 10, do the applications, are they being pushed via SCCM, or does your software pick up software that was installed out of the App Store? Does that make sense? I don't know if I explained that correctly.
Yeah, so I think what the question is if, there's 4 applications that were put onto the device via SCCM and then one that the user downloaded themselves.
Yeah.
I think is what the situation is.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll definitely do it'll reinstall the ones from SCCM because obviously SCCM has the package and knows.
Mm-hmm.
On the one that was downloaded outside the Software Center, I believe it will, but I'm a little reluctant to answer that part without checking with my technical product guys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fair enough. It looks like we've burned through the entire Q&A queue. Tim Davis from Flexera Software, any closing comments or calls to action that you'd like to leave our attendees with before we close up the webinar?
Sure. So I would encourage people to use the links that Tim has in his resources slide to access our website. You can also go directly to flexerasoftware.com and explore the solutions that we have to offer. You can find the free trials under our resource section and find additional information. You'll also find links if you'd like to ask more questions and contact us. There's a Contact Us button on most of our pages, so you can just click that, fill out your question, and somebody will get back to you.
Great. Thanks again, Tim. Thanks again, all of our attendees. Chris, going to hand it back to you to close out the event, sir. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much to the Tims, Tim Squared. That's what I'm going to call you guys. But thank you guys so much for joining us for today's presentation. You guys did a great job, and thank you everybody in the audience for joining us for today's webcast, Reducing Risk in Application Development Lifecycle, sponsored by Flexera and brought to you by RedmondMag.com. Thank you all for attending. Oh, don't forget, there's a bunch of resources in the resource tab. There's a bunch of white papers. The slides are in there for the links that Tim has right there. So feel free to go to the resource tab as you're exiting to get all that information. But thank you all for attending today's show. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, everyone.